name is Mubarak, and I'm the founder of Nonviolence International. I'm delighted to introduce today's event titled "The Two-State Solution is Dead. Now What?" This webinar is part of Nonviolence International series. We are all part of one another. The purpose of this webinar is to help shift the conversation away from a two-state solution. The two-state solution is no longer possible. We will explore together strategies for a future in which Palestinians and Israelis live in peace and equality. We want to thank Just Peace Advocate for co-sponsoring this event. You will hear from three impressive voices: Noura, Erakat, Jeff Halper, and Jonathan Kuttab. They are all challenging the status quo and asking us to bring about a new society or solution that can provide peace, equality, and dignity for all Israelis and Palestinians. Jonathan has written an important and timely book. He calls on us to change the conversation about Palestine-Israel. We seek to do this to change policy and thus improve people's lives. In the spirit of my dear friend Bishop Desmond Tutu, we seek a loving embrace of all people while always holding up those suffering and under oppression. Today's topic is a challenging one. We welcome various debates and we urge you to join the conversation on our web. I'm very proud to have founded Nonviolence International more than 30 years ago, and of all have accomplished so far, but I also ask your help increasing our power for the challenging times yet to come. Please support Nonviolence International and our wonderful partners working in the region and around the world. Thank you so much.
I want to welcome everybody and start this session. I'm very grateful for Nonviolence International as well as Just Peace Advocate to have put together this event. As we said, about 570 people subscribed, and we already have more than 260 participants. I welcome all of you. The question before us, and I think we need to get straight into it, is a very sensitive and a complex one. Many of you would know that I have written this book, Beyond the Two-State Solution, which you can download for free if you wish from the Nonviolence International website. And Jeff Halper has also written about this matter. But I think the most significant thing that we have to think about is that if the two-state solution is dead, what do we do now? How can we move the conversation forward? And I know this is very difficult for many people because so many of us, myself included, have been so invested in working very hard for the two-state solution. We really thought that at the time it made a lot of pragmatic sense, even though we realized it had its shortcomings, but we thought it was something we could work towards, that it was a goal, a vision that was realistic, that we can work with. And now it's clear that it's not happening. And if it's not happening, what then? Do we have a different vision? Do we have a different goal to work towards, to organize around? Does the two-state solution now become part of a problem? The language and the paradigm that it has introduced, which we worked so hard to achieve, has now become a nice alibi for doing nothing, for continued occupation, for a permanent state, for legitimizing basically a totally oppressive apartheid reality on the ground. So this is the conversation we need to have. And if anything should come out of this discussion is this conversation, this discussion. Some people are so totally committed to the two-state idea that the very concept of one state is alarming to them, and that they're totally opposed to it. And I sort of understand those people because, as I said, I was there myself for many years. That was the posture that many people took. We fight so hard to get somebody like Netanyahu to even utter the words two states. And now it's AIPAC that's championing the two-state paradigm and language. So this is what I wanted to say by way of greeting everyone, by way of setting the stage for the discussion and starting the discussion among ourselves. And I think this is the time to ask Jeff Halper to make his presentation.
Well, thank you all for inviting me. And I know many of you. I haven't gone through the whole list of the 250. And it's really good to see Mubarak. We've known each other for many years, but haven't seen each other very often. And of course, Jonathan, who's my old-time partner in crime. Let me just start by saying we have to completely reframe the way we're approaching this whole issue. You know, the whole two-state idea is based on a misanalysis. And if you misanalyze a political situation, you can't possibly resolve it. In other words, if I'm a doctor and I misanalyze someone that has cancer and I give them an aspirin for a headache, it's not going to help very much. You know, the medicine has to be appropriate to what the disease is. And the whole two-state solution is based on the idea that somehow there's a conflict. What I want to argue is that we have to give up this idea of conflict. I mean, you know, in other words, we talk about the Arab-Israeli conflict. We talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is not a conflict, because in a conflict, you need two sides, right? You need two sides that are fighting about something. And the way you resolve a conflict through conflict resolution is to bring the sides together, have them negotiate, work out the issues, come to some compromises, and get into some kind of a deal. It usually doesn't resolve the problem really, but it's a kind of a conflict management. It's really more conflict management than conflict resolution. But this isn't, there aren't two parties here. And what I want to suggest, and this was the basis not only of my book, but the organization that I'm involved with today, besides ICAD, that continues to be active, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, we're also a part of a Palestinian-led organization called the One Democratic State Campaign. And Jonathan is also in contact with us as well. And I think, you know, before you get into the details of how, you know, what the alternative would look like, maybe what a one state would look like, how do we get there, how do we, before all of that, we have to somehow impart to the public a different way of looking at this situation fundamentally. We have to get past the misanalysis to an accurate analysis that will then lead us to an appropriate resolution. And what I'm suggesting is the two-state idea is based on the idea that there are two sides. Well, the minute you say there's two sides, you're assuming two things. One is that both sides are legitimate. And I want to argue that the Zionist side is not a legitimate side. In other words, not that Jews don't have can have a national identity and be Zionists. Not that Jews can't, I mean, Jews have a genuine historical tie to this country, the land of Israel, Palestine. That's all well and good. But you can't be the most sincere and justified national movement, liberation movement for yourself, and at the same time colonize another country. You just can't do that. You know, in other words, if your liberation requires the subjugation of another people and the complete abrogation of their rights, you have to find another way to go. The very fact that Zionism chose to become a settler colonial movement, and they were very upfront about it. They called themselves settlers. They still call themselves settlers. We still talk about settlers in the settlements of the West Bank. We still use that language. Ben-Gurion was upfront about it. All the Zionist leaders were upfront about this whole thing from the 1890s until today. And that is that we're coming to this country in order to take it over. In other words, what I'm suggesting is we have to move from a model of a conflict to a settler colonial analysis. That Zionism was a settler colonial movement. It doesn't mean that Jews don't have a tie to this country. It doesn't mean there's not a national element to it. What it does mean is that it is in no situation, and settlers all over the world and other settler colonial situations also feel justified. Every settler colonial movement makes up a narrative about why the country really belongs to them, why they really should take it over. In no situation is settler colonial justified. And from that point of view, it negates the legitimacy of Zionism as a side. Settler colonialism is unilateral. You don't ask the indigenous population, can we come? Should we come? You don't take them into account at all. They're irrelevant. On the contrary, the whole idea of settler colonialism is we have an exclusive claim to this country. That's what Zionism has said until today. It's not that, you know, all right, we want a two-state solution. We're willing to take part of the country, but we recognize there's a Palestinian people that has rights, and so they'll get another. No. Zionism said the land of Israel belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. The famous Zionist slogan, it's a land without a people, didn't mean that there weren't people here. I mean, they knew there were people here. You know, Arabs on camels with keffiyehs, they knew that. What they meant was there's no other people here that have collective rights to self-determination, to a national identity, to the land that we do. There's only one claimant to this country, to this land, and that is the Jews. So this country belongs to us, and the Arabs here, and we certainly don't use the word Palestinians because we can't recognize their national existence because that would undermine our exclusive claims. So the Arabs, as we call them, in Israel we call them Israeli Arabs, the Arabs are irrelevant. In other words, we don't care what happens to them. The whole idea of settler colonialism is we take the country, we take the land, we rebuild, we replace the original society. We replace the Palestinian, we replace the names in Arabic of all the places. We replace the population, we dispossess them. What happens to them? We don't care. They can leave the country, we can expel them, they can stay here if they know their place. That's really irrelevant. The point is us. It's our story. And the issue is, how do we transform Palestine into the land of Israel? How do we transform an Arab country into a Jewish country? And the process that the settler colonial Zionists used was what we call, and what they called, Judaization. We're Judaizing Palestine. Now that's a word not everybody's comfortable with. It sounds vaguely anti-Semitic, except it's a Zionist word. This is exactly the term that the Zionists apply, and Israel applies to, we're Judaizing the Galilee, And there are position papers of the Ministry of Interior that talk about Judaizing the Galilee. We're Judaizing East Jerusalem. We're Judaizing Palestine. And the settler colonialist Zionist didn't mean part of Palestine. They didn't mean 78%. They meant all of Palestine from the Mediterranean, at least to the Jordan River. I mean, the revisionists like Jabotinsky also wanted the good part of Jordan. You know, and what Begin always says is, look, we already made our concessions. We gave up the Jordanian part of the land of Israel. So what do you want? We have a little piece here on the other side of the Jordan for us. So this is the dynamic of settler colonialism. Settler colonists come in to take over a country, to displace the local population, to take their land, the entire country. They're going to Judaize it. They're going to make it exclusively a Jewish country, and that's it. That's what Zionism is. So that if then you go from a settler colonial analysis and you try to apply a conflict resolution solution, it's not going to work. Because for Zionism, there's nothing to compromise on. There's nothing to negotiate. And of course, since the end of the Kerry aborted negotiations in 2014, there haven't been any negotiations. And there's nothing to negotiate. Because in a sense, Zionist settler colonialism has succeeded. It controls the entire country. And as we can see from the dynamics on the ground, there is no intention, and there never was an intention, of a Palestinian state emerging even in the occupied territory. That was never in the cards. In other words, the two-state solution is not dead. The two-state solution was never born because a settler colonial movement cannot give up part of its land and admit that there's another people living in the country that it claims. It just can't do that. So the whole idea of the two-state solution was based on a misanalysis. It was a bad diagnosis. And that's why all these negotiations and peace processes and initiatives all these years since 1967 have failed, because they have nothing to offer. And Israel has continued, and you have to recognize this, exactly in the same trajectory that it has since the 1880s. You know, steadily, relentlessly taking over the country and transforming the entire country into the land of Israel. So that's what we have to try to get across to the wider population. I write about it in my latest book called Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine. And it's a part of the One Democratic State program that you can look at, our 10-point program for a single democratic state. That's on our website, which is onestatecampaign.org, I think. So I just have another minute or two, I know, right? We don't have much time. So let me just say then that the solution, if you want to put it that way, the only way you can end a settler colonial situation, not a conflict, a unilateral settler colonial situation, is to decolonize, because it's a colonial situation. It isn't the same as the British in India, but it is the same as the whites in South Africa and the French in Algeria, and in many ways the United States, although the Native Americans have no chance of decolonizing. So that's another story. But in countries in which you have a population like the Palestinian population that's large enough and that still has aspirations for national liberation, then you certainly do have a process of decolonization in place. Decolonization meaning that you have to dismantle completely the colonial structures of control and domination that Israel, the Zionist movement in Israel, have put in place. You have to dismantle that. And then the other part of it, of course, is the vision that Jonathan mentioned. What is your vision? What's your plan? And that's where we've really been in a hard situation for all these years. We've either advocated for the two-state solution. I have to admit, I also advocated. I mean, if it was good enough for Arafat, I'm not going to be more Catholic than the Pope, you know, but it was a bad analysis. And in fact, the PLO made a great mistake. the Palestinian people, and were always anti-colonial. And the PLO was anti-colonial. They had it right at the beginning when they started into the 1970s, when the whole anti-colonial movement began to fade until 1988, when they finally gave it up. So the point I'm making is that decolonization is the only way to go, and decolonization is then followed by a reassembly of a new state, of a new civil society that is based, in our view at least, I mean, there's different one-state scenarios. Hamas has a one-state idea that we don't share, but in our conception of the single state, it's an inclusive democracy of equal rights for everyone living in this country, including, of course, refugees who return. Not a binational state, not a binational state, but there'll be national expressions for each national group, of course, but basically a state based on equal rights. So
okay.
what I want to say in the last sentence, if you will let me, is that I think, besides these discussions, and besides a paradigm change, and besides developing programs, we all have to become political. I think we have to kind of put the human rights stuff aside to some degree, although they're instruments of PR that are good, but they're not instruments of liberation. We have to put even protests aside, maybe BDS to some degree, or at least take all of those things, everything we're doing, and make them political. We've got to become political. We have to stop talking, and we have to start working with the Palestinians here on the ground that are often kind of left out of the whole discussions. In order
Jeff,
to become political, in order to get to this political solution.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you very much. That's a very powerful presentation of a total paradigm shift, paradigm change. You are saying the paradigm was wrong to begin with in the whole process, and this will open a very interesting discussion, I am sure. I apologize for not having introduced you correctly, but you're well known and your credentials, I think, have been placed in the chat box. I'll try to do a little better with Noura Erakat. She is also a well-known Palestinian American activist, university professor, legal scholar, human rights attorney. Currently, she's an associate professor at Rutgers University, specializing in international study. So I want to give you the forum now to speak. But before I do, I want to acknowledge Karen Rodman from Just Peace Advocate. She was supposed to also welcome you to this discussion. Just Peace Advocate is a Canadian human rights organization that is also co-sponsoring this event. You have the floor.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to everybody that's here. It's an honor to join you. Thank you, Jeff, for setting the groundwork for us from which to continue this discussion and to depart. I want to first affirm that I completely agree with your settler colonial analysis. I take slight issue with your framing of this as a misdiagnosis that led to the two-state solution as outcome. I think that the diagnosis has always been clear, as you acknowledge, by Palestinians in their theories on Zionism as a settler colonial project, as a form of racism, as a form of racial discrimination, that this was never at issue. There was never a misdiagnosis. There has been throughout the 100 years of Israeli settler colonization, a misbalance of power that has made it almost impossible for the Palestinian anti-colonial position to prevail. We see the juridical erasure of Palestinians as a people, first marked in the 1917 Balfour Declaration that referred to them, 90% of the majority of the whole, as non-Jewish. We see that affirmed in the Palestine Mandate in the League of Nations in 1922. We see it even affirmed in UN Resolution 181, which never designated a Palestinian state, but an Arab state that would be overseen by Transjordan. There had been, as a result of this imbalance of power, which is a colonial condition, not necessarily just a denial, but a rejection of Palestinian peoplehood and the right to self-determination. Palestinians rectified this themselves when Arafat and a number of Arab militias declare national liberation warfare in the context of Third World Revolt, take over the PLO in 1968 after the Battle of Karame, and declare that there will be a single democratic state. And by 1974, do the most radical thing when they enter into the United Nations as a player and assert their juridical status as a people in Resolution 3236, where it says that the Palestinian Liberation Organization is the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, thereby reinstating their status as a juridical people. They are no longer just a bunch of Arabs, Bedouins who can be scattered among the 22 other Arab states. They have the right to self-determination and national liberation. There was never a misunderstanding of this, but as you highlight, Zionists as a settler nation are insisting upon an opposite narrative, that they are indigenous, that they are returning. They cannot occupy a land that has been occupied by other people that they then liberate, as many of these UN transcripts testify, and in fact refer to Palestinians as marauders, as the hostile takeover, right? It's why they don't recognize even the West Bank and Gaza as occupied, but continue to insist that it's disputed. One, they continue to reject that Palestinians are not a people, and two, because they are the liberation movement. Now, so here what I want to insist upon, before I get to these other junctures and now what, is to say, one, that we really, as much as I also recognize that Jews can define themselves however they want, that is a prerogative. If Jews are a people, they are a people and a nation that is distinct and not merely a religion, that is distinct from the insistence that the settlement of Palestine is part of that national liberation, that is distinct from the claim that Jewish Zionist colonization is tantamount to return or liberation of the land, or that Jews are indigenous in the ways that they claim. Even Ben-Gurion has insisted that the settlement of Palestine and that Zionist manifestation in the state, Israeli state on this land, that they are part of the Middle East in geography only. They remain an extension of Europe. This becomes a satellite state for settlement. How do you become indigenous to a place where you claim belonging elsewhere as part of Europe? And rejection of everything indigenous to this land, which is why even Middle Eastern Jews were forced to reject their Arab identities, their Arab language, their Arab histories, because it was a rejection of everything about this land. So how is that indigeneity? So one, I want us in the spirit of being political, as Jeff encourages us, to not be afraid of saying that and rejecting that, and not tiptoeing around it and challenging that this is not Zionism is not national liberation. Zionism is not about indigenous resurgence. This is settler colonization. So what happens then if this is what Palestinians done in the path that they paved and finally in 1974 achieved this? Frankly, the power of the Palestinians diminished when they were routed out of Beirut and Lebanon more generally, forced to recast themselves in Tunisia, when we knew after 1973 that Egypt and Syria were no longer willing to wage a conventional war of liberation, that Palestinians could no longer launch cross-border attacks along the Lebanese or Jordanian border. There was no military solution. It was the Gulf War that then shifted the power within the Palestinian factions, and Arab support no longer for Fatah, and now even support for Hamas and Arafat's support of Saddam Hussein in the Gulf War was key to this, it was that weak position that led Palestinians into the Oslo trap, what I describe as a sovereignty trap. Palestinians writ large, the most radical of them, accepted two states as a pathway to liberation. Walid Khalidi describes it as the most radical turn. Now, the distinction is the two-state solution and the Oslo Accords are not the same thing. Oslo is an autonomy plan. It's a plan for reservations. And that's what Palestinians got. They got exactly what Oslo promised. It is similar to the Transky plans for Black homelands that was rejected in 1976 in South Africa that has become celebrated in the case of Palestine. And this Oslo trap is now finally falling apart for many of the human rights organizations like B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch. They're finally admitting that Israel has destroyed the possibility of a state, even though we knew that at the time of writing, even though it was clear that this was about autonomy and that this was false. And I think that Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, frankly, are jumping ship at the moment when they have to be on the right side of history before they're condemned to being accomplices to the annihilation of Palestinians at this last minute. But if we go back, what this outcome would suggest is that Israel became an apartheid state, as opposed to what Palestinians have said from the time of its establishment, which is that Israel is by nature an apartheid state. And so the pathway is not a juridical pathway of merely equal rights, right? But has to be a pathway to decolonization, which means the de-Zionization of this land. How do you de-Zionize land? Well, first of all, you need a lot of Zionists to reject Zionism. And so I applaud efforts like the anthology of A Land with a People. I have the honor of writing the foreword for that, where former Jewish Zionists describe their pathway of rejecting Zionism. This is a spiritual transformation, not merely a political one. Protest will help, but it also requires an absolute contending. Like, Jeff, with all due respect, you're one of the few vocal when people ask me, where's the Israeli movement, the anti-Zionist Israeli movement? I don't know. But this can't just, we can lead it as Palestinians, and we have, and we will continue to do that, and we will be the conscious, and we will sacrifice, and our people will be on hunger strikes, and we will go to jail, and we will lose our tenure, and we will be criminalized, and we will be surveilled. But there is no pathway forward without a movement that rejects Zionism head on. So yes, this is not a roadmap. This is not a blueprint. This is a revolutionary movement. It's the rejection of white supremacy. It's the rejection of Afrikaners who believed that they too were liberating South Africa and had been oppressed by the British and were liberating the land. This is a rejection that somehow Zionism is exceptional and unlike other forms of settler colonization, right? It's a rejection of the equation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So it's both the protest of what we reject and the creation of the vision of what we want, which isn't necessarily just that blueprint political pathway, but really how do we plant those seeds? So the anthology and the forums are one. I don't know how to build the anti-Zionist Israeli movement. That's not necessarily, I'm not gonna lead that. It's not my responsibility or my work, but that's necessary. It also means mapping, the counter mapping programs that organizations like Bedil and Zukhrut have done together with Salman Abu Sitta, who have literally mapped what the future would look like and what return could look like. It's projects of indigenous resurgence, of creating new narratives and relationships to the land and the seeds of this land. This land does not belong to Palestinians. Palestinians belong to the land. So what does it mean to belong to land? You have a responsibility to it. So that's the work of agriculturalists and folks who are tending to the land, like Vivian Sansour and others who are caring for it and creating a new knowledge about Palestinian seeds and what this land gives us. This also means a rejection and frankly, a pushback against the privatization of land, which cannot belong to certain groups of people, but has to belong to the commons, because that's what it means to belong to the land. You are there because you are responsible to it, right? And so this also means my work, this is where I fully take responsibility, a complete rejection and a dismantlement of the Palestinian official leadership, which is squarely part of the problem and the regression of these possibilities for a pathway forward. And that means also supporting, and this part I already do as much as possible, supporting the nascent leadership of new Palestinian leaders who have emerged. Arafat was a new leader who rejected the establishment when he emerged. And now there is a new leadership that is rejecting the official establishment that we must support. The Manifesto of Dignity and Hope and the May 2021 Palestinian Intifada or eruption, Intifada or Habbe, however people have described it, was led organically by this nascent Palestinian leadership across the entire geography, Palestinian geographies, from the river to the sea, as well as internationally. No centralization, no financial support, no diplomatic recognition, and yet managed in that moment, in this brief but critical moment, to squarely take aim at Zionism and to rehabilitate the Palestinians as a singular people on this land. So I apologize that I'm not here with the silver bullet for you, but there are many small ways and necessary ways to apply ourselves in order to get to this decolonial future. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. This has certainly been a very moving and thought-provoking presentation by you and Jeff Halper. And I would like to, before I open it for discussion from the group, to ask both of you to respond to the question of what is there in this vision for Israeli Jews? You are calling out correctly Zionism as a settler colonial movement. You are challenging the existing paradigms, which you are correct. The Palestinian Authority is participating in. It seems the entire international community is participating in. You are saying why this is fundamentally flawed and would fail to provide any measure of justice, any measure of dignity, any measure of rights for Palestinians. And you're proposing something else. Now, that something else can definitely address the needs of the Palestinians. Can you say how, and I'd like to give you, Jeff Halper first, a couple of minutes to respond to this, and then you, Noura, to respond. What is in it for those who are now benefiting from the success of the Zionist project, who are now in control of the entire land and who have the power, military, political, and otherwise, of the status quo, and who have great support in the international community? What is in it for them to abandon or to realize the failure or the ineffectiveness or the immorality of the Zionist settler project? Is there anything in it for them, or is it a totally a loss as far as they are concerned? Jeff, you start for 2 minutes, and then Noura for 2 minutes.
Well, I mean, there's a lot in it for Israeli Jews. On the political level, of course, I mean, we've only prepared a vague outline of a program, a 10-point program. I think it's a good start, and I think it addresses really important issues, but I mean, we have a long way to go to sell it, to have people participate in it, and so on, both obviously Palestinians, but also Israelis. But it envisions at least a democracy in which there's equal rights for everyone. What you write about, Jonathan, a constitution that guarantees not only equal individual rights, but equal collective rights for everyone. The big issue that remains in some ways, we won't talk about it now, is, would it be a binational state, since we really are talking about two national groups? or simply a unitary democracy in which nationalism will have to find other expressions, but partly because many Palestinians reject the idea of a binational state because they don't accept the idea, like I said, coming out of settler colonialism, that Zionists that Zionists is a national group, or the Jews here form a national group. It's like Noura said, Jews can form a national group, but not in terms of having a claim to the land and making their claim known, so that they get individual rights. More important, the idea that Noura mentioned about Ben Gurion and not belonging to the Middle East. In many ways, the aspiration of Zionism was to rejoin the Middle East. They saw that as the hearth of Jewish civilization. It was kind of bullshitty between us, but that was sort of a general idea, although Noura is absolutely right. They rejected everything about the Middle East. But in a sense, this solves the settler colonial problem. Mahmoud Mamdani at Columbia wrote a very interesting article a while ago called, he has a new book now that deals with this as well, about settler colonialism, but he has an article called Can the Settlers Become Natives? Or How Do the Settlers Become Natives? And the only way is through decolonization. That's the big thing that decolonization gives to the Israeli Jews. And that is that if they give up their colonial status and their power and the structures of domination and enter into a new, what he calls, and I elaborate on this in my book, a new political community, a new us. It's more than a civil society. It's a new political community that emerges within this new state that we've created, especially in the younger generation. Once that happens, the Israeli Jews, they don't become indigenous, but they achieve what I call sufficient indigeneity. In other words, they become a part of this polity. They become part of this political community. They become, and recognized as equal citizens by Palestinians, having the right to their own collective identity, however they want to express it. And that really is the only way out for settlers. They, in a sense, become almost natives, or they become sufficiently nativized that they can, that they can go on with their lives, which is really what everyone wants. Let's now get on with our lives together in this country. Just one thing, just to conclude, there's just one thing I want to a little bit disagree with Noura about strategically, and that is, it's true that you need an anti-Zionist movement here among Israeli Jews. I mean, obviously, but it's not going to happen. And you mentioned the ANC and the Afrikaners. I mean, it's the same situation. I think the ANC recognized that they were never going to get the whites in South Africa to be active against the apartheid system. That was not going to happen. So their strategy was to bypass the Afrikaners, even to bypass the South African government that was Afrikaner, and go directly to the international civil society, not governments, eventually governments, but through the civil society. That was also the strategy of the FLN in Algeria, who knew they were never going to themselves get the French to give up their colonial status and the settlers, the Pied Noir in Algeria, to give up their colonial status. And they did the same thing. They went to the international community, and that's what put pressure on France to finally withdraw. So I think what the Palestinians have to do is to forget Israelis. I mean, we'll try to bring in as many as we can. I mean, there are some. I mean, it's not, but there are some, and we are in touch, and actually we are reaching out to Israeli Jews, but it's going to be a fraction of a percent of the population. So I think the strategy has to be to forget about Israeli Jews, to go to the international civil society, which is the only powerful ally of the Palestinians, to create pressures on governments abroad to change their policies. And then, as I think, like in South Africa, I think it's doable, as the apartheid system in Israel over the Palestinians collapses, it begins to come apart, and BDS is a part of that. If BDS was more political and more connected to those plans, it would be much more powerful. Okay. Then when we get to a point of transition, as in South Africa, then the Israeli Jews, like the Afrikaners, will not have a choice but to come in. In the meantime, we prepared the ground because
Jeff.
our program is inclusive of Israeli Jews. It's not against them. I mean, they'll see their place in it, like the whites did in South Africa, and that's what will allow, I think, the transition to happen. But we can't hold ourselves up and have the illusion that somehow we're going to bring a critical mass of Israeli Jews into an anti-Zionist position. That's just not.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. Your 2 minutes or 8 were very much to the point. Noura, can you briefly address this question?
Let me take 5 at max, okay?
Okay, max.
At max. So let me start by saying, I think that there is about Israeli Jews. Number one, like any other peoples of privilege, why would anybody give up their privilege? This requires both coercive pressure in order to demonstrate that the cost-benefit analysis of rejecting a change is not worth it. But thus far, Israel's lack of accountability has imposed zero coercive pressure. Israelis literally have felt no consequences for Israel's aggressions against Palestinians, its constant systemic wars, and instead are constantly rewarded almost through their framing the powerful as the victims. So one is definitely continuing on the pathway towards that coercive pressure, but then what's in it is also this idea of what would be necessary as an incentivizing, right? I saw somebody in the chat, writing the admiration and the respect of their grandchildren. Absolutely, there is a moral imperative, but how do we get to that moral imperative? One thing that I've explored and that I think needs to be explored far more, and I say explicitly in the book, that Palestinians in thinking towards a decolonial future need to offer those Israeli Jews something far more optimal than what Israel offers them so far. What pathway do we offer for ourselves that not just is about our liberation and the rejection of something, but that creates a new situation where Israeli Jews also feel that they can belong, which is not mutually exclusive, as opposed to sovereignty, which is incommensurable, and where they can feel safe, right? Where they can, so now they definitely don't feel safe. That's part of that mentality. And one thing I think that we can shift to think about this, it's not the answer, but to think about this, is how Zionism actually never really combated white supremacy, which shaped Nazi racism, and instead left intact the concept that Jews can never belong or integrate, that they have to be exclusive and isolated, right? And that they are superior as God's chosen people. Like, these are things that were internalized into Zionist political project that then shapes Zionist settlement on the ground, that placed Middle Eastern Jews on the periphery, that today stratifies Israelis in racial hierarchy from Western European Jewish Zionists all the way down to Middle Eastern, then Spanish, and then Spanish, then Middle Eastern, and then right now African Jews, Eritrean, Ethiopian, and outside of that framework hierarchy altogether are Palestinians who are just marked for elimination. What happens when we shift to an anti-racist movement? And when Israeli Jews, find that their liberation is still not complete, anti-Semitism is alive and well. Israel did not solve that problem. So how is that potential for collaboration in an anti-racist movement where Palestinians and Jews are both in alliance against white supremacy and a future that actually does bode well for both? And then obviously there's going to be people who never want that, because nationalist resurgence is on the rise, not just in Israel, but in the United States, right? Where Robert Spencer says that Israel provides the model for the future of European sovereignty. In India, in Hindu Hindu supremacism in Hungary, in Brazil. There has been a move now and a national resurgence where Israelis are part of and provide the model for that future. We are at a crossroads. We can choose these futures. Our battle against white supremacy in the United States is part of that struggle in choosing that future. Our battle against settler colonization on these lands is part of that struggle. An alliance with the DAPL, an alliance against the L3, an alliance with the Black Lives Matter movement, and where this solidarity comes from. Why is this? I just want to point out three distinct, I'm sorry if I'm over five, last thing, but three distinct challenges from apartheid South Africa in particular. Number one, the ANC never collaborated with the apartheid government. The PLO has and is. And one of the things that I've confronted multiple times over in my international advocacy as a human rights attorney representing Palestinian human rights organizations is that diplomatic states, for example, tell me, well, we can't take the measures that you all are advocating because your government wants the opposite. The PLO hasn't even endorsed BDS beyond the West Bank and Gaza. So that's a major distinction and a problem that limits us, and we're still fighting and making strides despite those odds. Number two, Islamophobia. Unlike the fight against apartheid, where white supremacy was being condemned in multiple parts of the world, not least in the United States, right, where it was rejected and its juridical, Jim Crow was dismantled. When we fight, we're the terrorists. We're part of an Islamophobic network. We're part of the civilizational battle. I mean, it's yet an even greater challenge in overcoming these hurdles. And the other one is that Jewish Zionists continue to maintain the mantle of being righteous victims, even as they pummel us, even as a nuclear power. So we have, and that's why that's why Michelle Alexander wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said it's time to break the silence, even though most Palestinians hadn't been silenced, but so many are, specifically because when you speak, you have to reject and confront the idea that Jewish Zionists are not the victims here. So those are just some distinct challenges we have in doing that work.
Thank you. This is very succinct, and now we really have a discussion on our hands because there are many questions that are being raised. Some of them are being raised in the chat, and some of them are in the form of questions. Some of them are in the forms of comments. So we have to ask ourselves, one of the questions that are being asked is there anything pragmatic that we can offer? Or are we only challenging the ideology, challenging the morality, challenging the illegality and illegitimacy of Zionism and of the current paradigm? Are we just, what pragmatically can be done? Because we must understand that with all the support for Palestinian rights and with all the feeling of solidarity with Palestinians who are being oppressed, there is also a lot of sympathy and support for Israeli Jews that comes out of the experience of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust that they have suffered. So that even though that is not necessarily our problem, it really is our problem. And we really need to address at some level the paranoias as well as the abuse of the Holocaust to justify the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians. But in addition to the abuse, there is a genuine trauma there. There is a genuine feeling that needs to be addressed. So I think I saw some of the questions, especially Emmanuel Shahaf, who has some very direct challenge to the speakers. So I think if we allow him to speak, we will get a different perspective. Okay. I think if you unmute Emmanuel Shahaf, we can have, but please try to be succinct. I read some of your comments in the chat box. Emmanuel, please
Yes,
present
I'll be
your
very short. First of all,
question.
thank you very much, Jonathan. And I loved your introduction because it was spot on. You know, we have to be pragmatic. And that was, unfortunately, I didn't hear pragmatism from neither from Jeff nor from Noura. So talking about being pragmatic, I think we have to base ourselves on the existing political structures which are in place now. We can't just, you can't say it's all bad and we have to get rid of it and we have to start from scratch. We have to have a transition. And the transition that we propose, as I'm chairman of the Federation movement, is a federation between Israel and Palestine over the whole area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, not including the Gaza Strip in the beginning for pragmatic reasons. Okay, it would be a Jewish majority federation, but it would be an equitable one with a constitution as you propose, and a constitution which guarantees equality of both sides. I think that's the only way we can progress into something normal. Over time, that would probably develop into an existence like Jeff proposes, a democratic state for everybody, including the Gaza Strip. But for the time being, I think that's the best thing we can propose. And it's available, you know, just look Federation Movement. I've written about it, there are articles, Google it, and here, I leave it at that. I wish that other people would also join pragmatism along these lines. Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, thank you for this comment. I think it's more of a comment than a question, but I want to point out that Mazen Qumsiya has placed in the chat box 70 pragmatic ways to move forward. So some of you may be interested in looking at Mazen's suggestions. So
I'd also like to respond.
Okay, go ahead, Noura.
Yeah, I just want to say into the audience, and I'm just gonna, you know, with all due respect and with as much humility as possible, I think that it's almost offensive to say that what we said was not practical, that we didn't come here with a roadmap and tell you how to decolonize and liberate the land, is to assume that freedom movements have blueprints. And that's just not practical. No freedom movement they have visions, they have imperatives, they have efforts. So, and in that discussion to say, you know, what can be done in terms of book writing, in terms of movement building, in terms of supporting Palestinian leaders, in terms of how you donate, if you want to donate to young Palestinian leaders, defer to Palestinian leadership, center in your analysis and don't be afraid of what to critique. All of those are quite pragmatic. It's the local that's global. I'm expressing frustration as a Palestinian who almost in front of every audience people want me to tell them, how is it that we find freedom? And yet freedom is not a potion. Freedom is a number of different parts that move together through effort that produce a moment we can't anticipate. Freedom is our preparation. Ask Black people who are still fighting for their freedom, or Natives who are fighting for their freedom, or Kanaka Maoli who are fighting for their freedom, right? Or anybody who has successfully achieved a modicum of freedom. As South Africans will say, they never anticipated that the moment of their liberation would come. We've offered BDS, we've offered hunger strikes, we've offered direct action, we've offered blocking the flotilla, we've offered the blocking freeways, we've offered congressional advocacy, we've offered the pathways. Only recently have people even started listening to Palestinians. Only recently have I been able to speak without having to debate somebody, because it would have been anti-Semitic to have me speak by myself. Those are all products of this movement to freedom. So I just want to insist on people to expand your imagination of what is it that we think of when we're thinking of pragmatism, and to have far more faith in the work that we are doing and its incremental success, despite the ongoing trampling of our rights on the ground and here.
Thank you, Noura.
Thank you, Noura. I think if nobody is feeding me questions, I think there's a question from Mark Braverman, if we unmute him. Mark?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So I want to introduce one more topic here that hardly ever gets raised in these discussions, and I promise you, Jonathan, that I have a question that's coming. And that is the role of the churches on a global basis in this struggle, in terms of the actual political and organizing strategy. First of all, I think we're very much not only on a political battleground, but on a theological battleground. That one of the comments pointed out that one of the major barriers is, and I think Noura, you've touched on this as well, and Jeff as well, that the settler colonial project is being supported and defended on biblical, on theological grounds, and that in some sense you can say that most of the world, both Jews and Christians, believe this. And so that has to be taken on directly, and the churches are beginning to confront Christian Zionism directly. And out of Kairos, Palestine, out of Bethlehem and out of Sabir in Jerusalem, there is now a global network of churches and people at the grassroots of the churches that are taking this on. So my question is, and I'd like both Jeff and Noura to address this. Jeff, I've spoken with Ilan about this. The One Democratic State campaign, it seems like it's taking place pretty much exclusively within 1948 Israel. I don't see the dots being connected to both Bethlehem and East Jerusalem in terms of the incredible power of this global church movement. And Noura, I'd like you to comment on that as well. I don't think that there is an understanding or a recognition, and the dots have not been connected there. And if you again take a look at the South African paradigm, the South African example, it's a little known story. We know about Desmond Tutu, but there's a little known story about how, on a global ecumenical basis, the churches actually delegitimized in terms of excommunication, or the Protestant equivalent of excommunicating the churches in South Africa, the white English-speaking churches and some of the black churches as well, that were actively theologically supporting apartheid in their policies. And when the churches finally turned against apartheid South Africa, that had a major impact on both the Thatcher and the Reagan governments to join the boycotts, to join the sanctions, and it made a huge difference. So I'd like you both to comment on that. And how can we do a better job of connecting the dots between the various political movements that are happening and the fact that the church is also a force for political change in the world?
Okay. Jeff, you want to address that briefly? We have a lot of questions here, but I want to give you a chance to respond.
I'll be brief because I don't have a lot to say about it.
Thank you.
Although it's a very important issue. Look, the churches are really major players. I mean, here as well in terms of leadership, but certainly abroad. And they played a key role, obviously, in the anti-apartheid movement and in many other, they're involved today as well in many things. I think, and we have begun to address that to some degree. I mean, we had ICAD USA, which is our American branch, the Israeli Committee Against Hostile Demolitions, last month had a webinar on Christian Zionism. That was very interesting. It was Stephen Sizer and Don Wagner and yours truly, Jonathan, who were on the panel, and I think it opened all kinds of new perspectives for people, including how do you, I think Christian Zionism has a tremendous impact even beyond the evangelical churches in the States, and we have to find ways of addressing that. I guess what I would say is the churches are very important, but in my experience, and I'm not Palestinian, and I'm not privy to everything inside, the churches here have not been very political. They've done wonderful things. I mean, the Kairos document, and there's all kinds of things, and we're in touch with a lot of them. But they shy. It's true not only of churches in the U.S. It's true of a lot of the support groups in the U.S. That support the Palestinian issue. That's why I said we have to become political. The support groups in the U.S., the churches in the U.S., the churches here have not made that transition to actually talking political talking about political programs, talking about organization, and really allowing people like us to have a stage. So I think the work has to be done within the churches to get them to begin to think more politically, more in terms of liberation, and then we certainly have a lot to talk about.
Thank you, Jeff. Jonathan, we have to recognize Dora Bender. Can you do
Dora
that?
Bender, please unmute her. Please unmute
Hey
her.
guys. Hi to everyone. Yeah. Well, my name is Dora and I'm from Israel. I'm active in a nonprofit named Challenge, and we're dealing with conflict transformation. One of our projects is actually the federal form, and we promote and we look at the option of providing a federal solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As part of my role, I am touring the land, and I'm speaking to many Palestinian and also Israeli settlers. And it's been wonderful. You know, every time that I'm going on a webinar or a Zoom conference, I always look for the word of hope. So I'm bringing that there is hope down there in the land. The people do want to live together. The people do want ready to share the land. And we're working on finding commonality between the people. As it is right now, we're starting about economic relationship between settlers and Palestinians to see how it's working and what is bringing to the people on the land. And I know, well, you know, I'm maybe Zionist, I'm dark skinned, so you can put me in a profile of, you know, like a white Zionist. I do enjoy my work, so I'm asking Jeff, and by the way, Noura, I loved you. I loved what you're saying, and you're a woman, and I'm sending you a big hug. You know, great work, and I want to hear you, like, from your perspective, how do you think if we speak today in terms of commonality between the people, isn't that going to be more benefit? Because as today, what I hear is apartheid, negative, rejection. Okay, we know that it exists. So if we're trying to make a transformation to a conflict, how do we work on commonality? You, Jeff, and you, Noura, the asking is for you. Where do you see the commonality come together?
Thank you.
Nora's going to respond.
Sure. So
We
Dora,
don't want to respond now. I would like to have all the questions in and then later on the response, because we have so many people, Jonathan. Let's have their question and then we respond to those. Gerald Sorota.
The particular panel is one of a series that you're doing, Nonviolence International, and we have to respect that people have presented a vision, as Noura said, or an analysis framework that they shared. I think it's important to bring in this federation idea, and perhaps the next session to have Emmanuel speak, and perhaps Omri Boehm of the Haifa Republic. There's a lot of thinking on how a singular state would accommodate a binational model. So my question is really, it's come up indirectly, but both speakers agreed that the Jews are a national group, not just a religious group, and have a connection with the land, even if the instrument was more than fallible. It was vicious and horrible in its manifestation. But is the one state conceivably a binational state? I also want to say that Jonathan's monograph is very pragmatic. Those who haven't read it, he's the ultimate pragmatist. But he also raised an issue that I think is part of the binational question. Which is the emotional baggage or pain that's there for both peoples. And any response and the steps towards a response have to respond to the reality of the Holocaust, which is in people's memory, the reality of the Nakba, which is in people's memory and in some ways ongoing. Both of those are ongoing emotional traumas. If the goal is to live together, then we need to begin marking those, as Ahmad Tibi did in the Knesset when he marked International Holocaust Memorial Day, and as those of us in the Jewish community and in the Israeli Jewish community need to do, which is to mark the Nakba and to recognize our part and our sorrow about it. So, but my question is on the issue of the binational elements within the singular state that that both of you advocate for, and that Jonathan has given pragmatic expression to in his book.
Jennifer Miles.
Please unmute yourself, Jennifer.
Yeah, so I just had a quick question. What would you say to Israeli Jews who fear for their safety in a proposed federation that may have a Muslim majority?
Okay, thank you.
That will be addressed. I think we see Larry again. Unmute yourself and speak. Larry, unmute yourself.
Unmute my. Can you hear me
please.
now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. I think the cause of the biggest problems are the violence, and the cause of the violence are the weapons. And unless we can stop the weapons flow to Israel, cut off everyone, people are profiting with every day, with every bullet, with every bomb, with every death, and with every injury. And they're getting rich off of it, not only there, but all around the world. The violence in the United States, people are laughing at people who are trying to find pragmatic solutions to things, when people are only people. And the only way we're going to stop it is if we are disabled, if our hands are tied and nobody can cause any violence. That is pretty much as impossible as anything else in the world with this situation. But we have to stop the weapons, we have to stop the violence, and we have to take it all away from the people who want to cause the violence. Then people will talk.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have Mary Nesnick. If you unmute yourself, and then we'll give the speakers a chance to respond to all these questions. Mary, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I really appreciated Dora Bender's comment about the need for hope and the need for sort of the very local, small scale economic efforts. But I also think that the United States really is a big elephant in the living room. And I do think that it's a domestic US pathology that we also need to address if we live here. And I think that I would like to hear Jeff say what his political plan is, because he keeps saying there's no political plan. So I would like to hear him define a political plan, and I'd like to see him come here and work with the synagogues, because it really is a domestic US pathology, and the flow of weapons comes from here and then they're rebranded and sold by the Israelis. So it's a dance of death. And then Noura, tell us what you feel would be practical for US citizens and those who are part of civil society, because I just think that the US is also a party to this and enabling it in a way that an alcoholic receives vodka. That's it.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you for your comments. I think there are a lot of very important questions in the chat box and comments. I see Roger Waters here suggesting that we need to use football and we need to get FIFA to kick out Israel for its apartheid policy, which is I think would be a very important step in translating international objection to apartheid into something concrete on the ground. But time is catching up, and there are so many comments. I want to give the two speakers again 5 minutes each, and this time really please try to stick to it. We'll have Noura first, and then Jeff, just giving concluding remarks and responses to some of the questions that were given. Noura?
Thank you. I have 5 questions or 4 for myself anyway. So Dora, again, thank you so much for that energy and that enthusiasm. I share your hope. There's no way I've been in this for as long as I have if I was not an infallible optimist, moved and shaped by cynicism in response to the facts on the ground. Those 2 things are not mutually exclusive. I have a lot of hope, and I think that our movement has made tremendous strides, as I mentioned, just in terms of representation, spaces that we've entered, recognition, the growth of the BDS movement, the number of artists and celebrities, for example, who have found the willingness to endorse BDS, the number of workers who have not unpacked Israeli goods. It's been tremendous. Even now, the Sydney Arts Festival, the number of artists who won't participate because of the support of the Israeli government, all the successful academic boycott, and so on and so forth. We've been doing great work. 6 Palestinian prisoners dug themselves out of what's known as the safe with spoons. Palestinians have not stopped. We have so much to be hopeful for. So where do we find commonality? As I mentioned earlier in my talk, I think that we find commonality in a common struggle against white supremacy. The greatest threat to anti-Semitism is not Palestinians, it's white supremacy. It was Donald Trump and his ilk and the conspiracy theories. Palestinians are not targeting Israelis because they're Jewish. They're targeting them because they are their military occupiers and oppressors. And so I want us to, that is the common ground. We are in a struggle together for that freedom. Number 2, Gerald, about binationalism. I think the question of binationalism for me is not theoretical as much as it is procedural. The fact that Zionism was imposed by force and continues to be imposed by military force and punishment is the problem, and that binationalism cannot be achieved by force. That if that were to be achieved, that would be achieved in some sort of collaboration. Palestinians never rejected Jewish immigration. They rejected Jewish Zionist settlement, right? Jews have always been welcome. They just were not welcome as masters and sovereigns of the land within a colonial framework. So I do not think I think binationalism is a possible outcome. I don't think it's the next step. I think that you get that to a decolonial process. Any next steps have to go through a de-Zionization, any next steps. And then belonging then can look a myriad of ways when there's not a gun pointed at our heads that says take it or leave it. And so that leaves the question, well, then how do you recalibrate the balance of power? And that's the moral work. That's the moral shifting that happens. That's the spiritual shifting that happens, where Palestinians are not going to be free by military power or through military attacks on Israelis. That is not recalibrating the balance of power, but our moral power is. And so is the coercive pressure on Israel that there are consequences, that this is not worth the cost. The question about Jewish safety in this outcome, again, I want to emphasize Palestinians do not attack Israelis because they're Jewish. Palestinians are primarily secular, and even the religious ones believe that Jews are people of the book. This is not, there is anti-Semitism in the Middle East, but we can't graft a European anti-Semitism onto that history. The same way as there was slavery in the Arab world, but we can't graft a US transatlantic history of the slave trade and slavery onto those historical genealogies. And yet that's what's been done. Palestinians will not attack Jews because they're Jewish. They have not done that. They have attacked Israelis as oppressors. And even for the most part, but in this discourse, all of that is lost. Even the attacks on military installations are framed as terroristic attacks. Even when Palestinians are shot, they're being told that they are the aggressor. So but that's part of the spiritual work. You're not going to believe me. That's part of the spiritual work. When you see that Palestinians and Jews actually coexist, even Jewish settlers. I saw it in Hizma, at a nature preserve that was turned into a national park, where the Palestinians that were on that land now have to pay an entrance fee to enter. And when they enter, they still enter. And I was with a group of Palestinians from Hizma on this trip, where when we entered, under their breath, they were so angry that they have to pay to enter their own land. And they were so angry. And yet when they reached the national spring, they were sharing their plates of food with the Jewish settlers who were also at the national spring, at the natural spring. This is not just about people to people. We're talking about structures. And so on the last one, and for those who say, let the children be in cooperation while they're young, that's been done. But note that the issue is that when those Israeli children grow up, they still enlist in the army. So we also know this is not also where we should place all our hope. And then finally, the hope in the US role. My hope in the US is how much we've shifted the US and how much the transnational solidarity work has now made Palestine part of the progressive platform, and even created a wedge within between the Democratic and Republican Party, but you can see it mostly within the Democratic Party itself, and the fractures within.
Thank you, Noura. Jeff.
Well, I don't know where to start. I mean, first of all, I'm not a big
You're to finish, not to start here.
I'm not a big fan of hope, I have to tell you. Hope is kind of a religious concept, and it's nice, but it's not very political. Optimism is, and being proactive is, but hope, I believe in hard work and a political program and organization and strategy. Corporations didn't hope to run the world. Corporations had a plan for how they're going to take over. But Trump didn't hope to be president. Yeah, it was a lot of hard work and organization that went into that. So I think we have to balance hope. I think we have to keep, I think we have to turn it around, believe that if we have a good strategy and a good program and a good organization, we don't need hope. We need a good hard-headed strategy to achieve our aims. Now, there was a question about, how do we guarantee the security of Israelis in a Palestinian majority state? And the one state will be a Palestinian majority state. There's already a Palestinian majority here. And I have to say, there's already one state here. I mean, there's no federation. There's no two states. There's one settler colonial entity here. That's why we call it apartheid. We don't say Israel, only the occupied territories are under apartheid. It's a whole entire settler, and that's why settler colonialism is so important, because it broadens our vision from just looking at the occupation to looking at the entire country. And that's the problem, not 22% of it. And it's interesting that people always ask about Israeli security. They never ask about the security of Palestinians. I mean, here, Palestinians have been attacked for 140 years. They've been dispossessed. They've been displaced. Half of them are refugees. You have I'm the head of the Committee Against House Demolitions. There's been 60,000 demolitions of Palestinian homes in the last 50 years. There's killings, there's imprisonment, and yet the Israelis worry about their security. I mean, I would think the first question will be, how do we guarantee Palestinian security in one state that Palestinians fear? And this is something we have to address, that one state could actually be a code for continued Israeli control. Because if the Israelis are stronger economically and institutionally and so on, in one state, they could continue to rule. So that's something we have to deal with on that side. And that's the problem with the federation. And you hear it from what Emmanuel says, exactly. His definition of a federation is a Jewish majority federation. Now, how you have a Jewish majority federation in a country that has a Palestinian majority, I'm not sure how that works exactly, but that's that same fear that we simply cannot build upon. And that's that's not only built into settler colonialism, because settler colonialism by definition is insecure, because the oppressed, the colonized, can never ever routinize and accept their oppressed status. So they're always going to resist. And so that question of our security, what people don't take into account is when you finally get to, like South Africa did, when you finally get to a point of a just resolution, whatever it is, then there's no more reason to fight. There's no more issue of security. You're not looking over your shoulder every time you go down the street because there's no resistance to what you've done. If you build something together and it gives equal rights to everyone, then that's where the security comes from. And that leads me to this idea that I just want to mention. I'm not going to answer all the questions, but go back to this idea of a political community, because that's really the vision. We have our political program. And again, you can see it on I think it's onestatecampaign.org, a 10-point program. I don't really have time now to outline it. But what it envisions really in the end, like I said, isn't only the emergence of a new state that gives equal rights to everyone, not only the emergence of a new civil society integrated in which everybody participates, but a new political community, a new sense of an us, in a way of a people, you know, that comes out of the daily life. And I'll give you one example to answer Roger's non-question, but I think about football. I have a, in the FIFA standings, FIFA for Americans is the International Football or Soccer Association. The Palestinian national football team has a higher ranking than the Israeli national team. Now, neither Israel or the Palestinian teams have ever managed to get into the World Cup. The World Cup is like the Super Bowl, but 1,000 times more. I mean, imagine then if in our state together, our best football players come together and manage to get into the World Cup. Do you know what that would mean? That's political community. And it's not planned and it's not, but that would be our home team. Now there's an our. We're rooting Israelis and Palestinians, but all of us as a part of this new state that we don't have a name for yet. Even the name of that state has to emerge with the new identity of the new population. But we're rooting for our team in the World Cup. That is a nation building kind of a thing that comes out of the daily life. And you replicate that in terms of us working together daily, watching the news daily, being in politics, going to school, living together and so on. And that's where a new political community emerges. And in that new political community, there's no resistance. We're building something together and hopefully we'll have a flourishing economy as well. And that's where the security of everyone comes in. It's a win-win for everyone. And that's really, I think, the most important thing that I want to leave. It's not a matter of hoping, but it's a matter of really building a political system that addresses the grievances and the needs of the two peoples. Now, whether it'll be binational or not, like Noura says, we haven't gotten there. There's a lot of work that has to be done. There's certainly a binational reality here. My problem with binationalism is that like in Lebanon, it keeps those artificial borders going. In my political community, I want us all, we'll still be Israeli Jews and religious and Muslims and Christians or whatever we are, that's fine. Part of our program is the Constitution guarantees the collective rights of everyone in this country. But what I'm hoping is that a new people will emerge, a new political community. That happened in Jordan, even though Jordan's a completely artificial state. That's happened in many other countries. There was never a Kenya before their anti-colonial struggle. So that political community can happen. And then in that political community, that happens, we begin to vote for each other's parties. There begins to be much more fluidity. Wait, just one more sentence. And what I'm trying to say here is that binationalism interferes with that. Binationalism perpetuates these borders between us that that I would like to see fall. On the other hand, the Palestinian, a lot of Palestinians object to the idea of binationalism, like I said, because they feel that that legitimizes the Zionist colonial entity. So it's an argument. It can go both ways. I'd be happy with both kinds of states,
Jeff.
but it's really something we have to work out for the future.
Jeff, you had us going on a very hopeful note when you were talking about the joint Arab-Jewish team going to the World Cup. But really,
not a Jewish team. Not a Jewish team.
No,
Jewish. Our team, whatever.
Our team. I'm really grateful to the over 300 people who have been with us for this long time. I tried to present my vision beyond the two-state solution, which you can download, as I said, because I think that ultimately what is important is to address the needs, concerns, and fears of ordinary people. States and ideologies exist only to serve. They don't have a right to exist on their own. They need to address the needs and the desires and the hopes and the fears and the traumas and the history and the culture and the tradition of ordinary, genuine human beings. And I think it can be done. And this is, by the way, where hope fits in. I may not be very optimistic about how soon that will happen, but I have a hope that sustains me and that gives me the courage and the ability to continue on this fight for human dignity, for everybody's dignity, working for peace. And nonviolence is very important because I can't work for a good solution if I'm out there with a gun or a bomb or an airplane or a bulldozer trying to achieve my goal. I need to work collaboratively with others. I need to have a peaceful, nonviolent tools to bring me to the solution that I desire.
Thank
That's
you,
my
Jonathan.
2 minutes.
Thank you. And I want to thank everybody who participate with us. It's an amazing thoughts and ideas. I want to thank also the 3 people who, one of them is you and Noura, Erakat, and Jeff Halper for their ideas. It's a way of having a lot of people hear different things, and that's important for us. I want to thank Michael Beer and David Hart as co-director of Nonviolence, that they put those things together with a lot of interns and volunteers, and that's important. And I find that people are hungry for peace and justice, to understand that a group of people, they cannot continue in a position that a government control them, and especially the people in Gaza. And then the people of the world are quiet. And our intention, our ideas for this webinar and for these Zooms is to have a lot of people start thinking what we as individuals can do to help those people in Gaza and the Palestinians and the Israelis together. And so one thing is that it's good to speak out. Speak, okay? Jonathan is one person, and he wrote a book, and he spoke out. So a lot of you can speak the same thing. Just put your ideas, your vision in one place. And then you'll have other people can help you. And one of the person who helped Jonathan to send his book to all the Senate is Tom Getman. Another one person, he was able to commit himself to send it to all the senators. This is great. We have to have a discussion, and that discussion have to be between your family, between your community, between your friends, between the church, the synagogue, and the mosque. And don't be afraid to discuss something that everybody is opposing. We discussed something that government oppose, and we are happy with it. And that's all right. We have to make our own vision as individual that justice is important, that people should not be, and human rights important to everyone. And that becomes part of our life in committing ourselves to help others. We have to look at things, at oppression, discrimination, hatred, and war, and try to change it if we can, as individuals, groups, or whatever we can and how we can, to direct it towards peace rather than war. We need compassion. And I'm so sad, one of my friends died just last week, Desmond Tutu, who believed so much in reconciliation. We need more of us to take the place of Desmond Tutu. Forgiveness is part of our life, and to have people, whatever they do, we have to forgive them with the hope that they wouldn't do it again. We have to accept each other, religion and culture. And it's not our job to change anybody's culture, anybody's language, anybody's religion. Let them enjoy that, their heritage. And that's what we are as people, is to be human and to accept everybody as they are. And thank you again. And I would like also to ask Paige to take over, because she has some recommendation for our next time. Paige, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Mubarak. This is just a few last announcements before we close. Thank you all for coming. This event is part of our webinar series called We Are All Part of One Another, and it reflects what we think is an ancient truth that lies in the heart of all world religions and scientific understanding of all humans, that we are intensely social and interdependent creatures. And through this, we've been able to record some really interesting topics that you can check out. As part of NVI, I'm an intern, but NVI is a backbone organization for global nonviolent movements. We provide fiscal sponsorship and training, spread knowledge and transformative stories of dynamic and emerging nonviolent movements that give us hope in difficult times. In short, basically, we are aiming to reshape what we view as possible and bring some more hope. Today, we want to thank Karen Rodman and Just Peace Advocates for their co-sponsorship of this webinar. Thank you very much. And just some final announcements before we close. Our webinar will be, as you can see, it's been recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel just under Nonviolence International on Friday. So it should be out by tomorrow. You can also, if you want to stay updated on the series and anything else that NVI does, check out our Facebook and Twitter that I'm sure an NVI individual will be able to pop down below. I also invite you, if you want to continue this discussion, or maybe you would like to watch over this or share with other people, join us for a watch party on Wednesday, January 19th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. We will watch this event and Jonathan will be able to answer some additional questions that come forth. Jonathan's book is published in Hebrew and Arabic, so please consider hosting book launches in Palestine and in Israel in February. If you're interested in that, you are able to contact Jonathan or NVI for more information. And lastly, consider becoming a supporter or volunteer for NVI and help us continue to shift this conversation as we work together to find a solution. So if possible, I think it would be amazing if we could all say goodbye together. So what's going to happen is we are going to ask everybody to unmute, and I'm going to count down and ask everybody to say a quick goodbye. Thank you all for coming again, and we look forward to engaging more with you in the future and continuing this discussion. So we will say goodbye in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Bye,
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.